Okay. Hello. So you've probably clicked on this video because you want to hear me sing. No, I'm totally messing. You've clicked on this video because you're studying for the verbal section of the SAT, and video 101 covers a very important grammar concept. I'd almost say kind of the foundation of the grammar on the test. So I promise you that by the end of this video, you'll know exactly what you need to know in order to do the problems on this worksheet and to do them with a sense of intention and purpose, where you know exactly what you're trying to learn and how you're trying to learn it. Um, so the objective right now in this video is for you to, one, be able to discriminate between what's an independent clause and what's not. The SAT really likes to test students on how to combine independent clauses, and it's important to know how to combine them. But before you can apply the rules of how to combine independent clauses, you have to first know what an independent clause is and be able to identify it. If you're having difficulty identifying an independent clause, it's going to make it difficult to then know kind of when to apply the appropriate rules. So we'll first look at kind of exactly what an independent clause is. Second, we'll look at what the rules are for combining them. And third, I have a special treat for you. Third, what we'll do is we'll look at this new type of problem that's on the digital SAT that I think a lot of students are going to have difficulty with. I'm going to explain this type of problem. I'm going to give you the heads up on it. So I'll call it like a new situation that has arisen that we'll break down. Okay. So anyway, that's the objective of this worksheet. Let me start off with a very common problem I can almost guarantee you'll see on the SAT. So I'll write it right here. Really simple. John hit the ball, comma, he ran to first base. If you know why this is incorrect, great. If you know how to correct it, very good. But here's the thing. In order to get this type of problem right every time, you want to be able to break it down exactly for what it is. And what I mean by that is this is called a comma splice. It's called a comma splice because you're trying to put together two independent clauses with only a comma. That is always wrong. We'll talk about how you can combine two independent clauses, but as I promised, let's first just identify what an independent clause is. So a clause itself, I'll even scroll down. So a clause itself has a subject and a verb. You're not creating any sentences without a subject and a verb. You need to have both. That's the essential backbone of any sentence. So you must have a subject and a verb. But not all clauses can you put a full stop or a period after. In other words, not all clauses are independent clauses. To be an independent clause, you must have a subject, a verb, and the idea needs to be complete to the point where you could put a full stop or period at the end. John ran is a very simple example. John is your subject, ran is your verb. Your idea is complete. You can put a full stop after that. An extreme example would be if I said stop. So your verb is stop, and the implied subject is you. On commands, the implied subject is always you. I'm saying you stop. But anyway, an independent clause must have a subject and a verb and complete the idea. A dependent clause has a subject and a verb because it's still a clause, but the idea isn't necessarily complete. An example of that would be although John ran, right? I still have John and ran, subject verb, but I haven't completed my idea because of although. Although is what's called a subordinating conjunction. We'll talk about those in just a moment. But essentially, if you put a word like although out front at the beginning of your independent clause, it's going to become dependent, right? It's although John ran, comma, and then it's dependent on the second part, the part after the comma, to be an independent clause and to give you an actual sentence. Okay. So we know what clauses are now, and we know what an independent clause is. Okay. But the key thing is you want to be able to identify when you have an independent clause and when you don't. So I have that example up at the top, this comma splice, but I'm going to take you to another comma splice. So John hit the ball, he ran to first base. John hit the ball, John is a subject, hit is a verb, the ball completes the thought, that's an independent clause. He ran to first base, he is a subject, ran is a verb, to first base, I complete the idea. That's also an independent clause. You can never combine two independent clauses with only a comma. That's called a comma splice. If I just get rid of the comma and it looks like that, that's called a run-on. Okay. But the test isn't that simple. They're going to come up with ways to add things in to make you think it's okay when it's not. Don't worry, we're going to go through exactly what we need to know. So I'll scroll down right now. I'm going to show you another comma splice. So in red here, we have Layla. Let me move my head out of the way. We have Layla drove her car into London. She could not find parking. So Layla is a subject, drove is a verb. Her car into London completes the idea. That's an independent clause. She is the subject. It's a subject pronoun. Could not find parking. That is subject, verb, complete idea. Two independent clauses. You cannot combine them with just a comma. That's a comma splice. Here's what you can do. You have exactly 4 options if you want to keep the two independent clauses. And you want to have these 4 options down pat. 1 is you just put a full stop there. 2 is you use a semicolon. We'll talk about semicolons in just a moment. 3 is you use a comma, but coming after the comma is one of 7 coordinating conjunctions, or the fanboys. It has to be one of 7 special words to allow the comma to stay there with the transition word in order for the 2 to hold up. And then the last one is we can use a colon. So these are your 4 options for combining 2 independent clauses. Nothing else is okay. Okay, I'll repeat that. Nothing else is okay. Let's look at these 4 options. So first, let's talk about semicolons. So a semicolon, I'd say more than 95% of the time. If you're curious about the rare example of how a semicolon is used outside of how it's normally used, you can check it out on this worksheet here, but I'm not going to talk about this right now. I'll just leave that there for you later. For reference, that's on page 4. Okay, but let's talk about how a semicolon is almost always used. So what a semicolon does is it's used to hold up 2 independent clauses, okay? In fact, if you see a semicolon, the first thing you're doing is you're treating it like a full stop. You're checking for an independent clause on both sides. If you don't have an independent clause on both sides, you cannot use a semicolon there, except for this very rare exception. But essentially, if you don't have an independent clause on both sides, you cannot use a semicolon. The test will not make you choose between a full stop and a semicolon because they both do the same thing. So it's not a matter of which one is subjectively better. It's just a matter of they both do the job. So the test has to be objective. You won't be forced to choose between the 2. For your own information, use a semicolon if the 2 ideas are related, where full stop, anything can come next. But anyway, we have Aisha hates spiders. That's an independent clause. She has arachnophobia. That is an independent clause. So this is completely acceptable. We can hold these 2 up with the semicolon there. The other thing you could do is, and I'll show you more on this later, but you can have 2 independent clauses and then you put what's called a conjunctive adverb here. So I'll give you another example. Aisha hates spiders. Semicolon, therefore. So therefore is a type of coordinating word. It's called a conjunctive adverb. Therefore, she avoids them. So we have 2 independent clauses. Aisha hates spiders. She avoids them. And don't be confused here. The therefore isn't doing anything. It's just window dressing. It's the semicolon itself that's holding up the 2 independent clauses. And therefore is just a transition word to kind of ease the transition. But we could easily just get rid of the therefore here and say Aisha hates spiders, she avoids them. 2 independent clauses. So that's a semicolon. Now let's look at the different types of transition words or connecting words. Specifically, we're going to look at your coordinating conjunctions or your fanboys, okay? Because those words are special. So there are 3 different types of transition words. So again, let's say we have a comma splice. I'm just going to use a little bit of whiteout here. So this would be incorrect. Gerald needed petroleum, independent clause. He pulled over at the next station, independent clause. Comma splice. I can keep the comma, but I have to use one of for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so. The acronym is fanboys. All of these are 3 letters or less. So a comma with any of these 7 special words, these coordinating conjunctions or fanboys, can hold up to independent clauses. Just a heads up, you'll never see a semicolon working together with a fanboy. A semicolon will work with a conjunctive adverb, like that example we just used a moment ago with therefore, but a semicolon will never work with one of your fanboys. If you're using a fanboy to hold up to independent clauses, it's with a comma. So anyway, definitely want to know the fanboys because Gerald needed petroleum, so he pulled over at the next station. That is completely correct. But if I say I get rid of so and I choose a different transition word, I'll use therefore, which is an example of a conjunctive adverb. So if I use therefore here, Gerald needed petroleum, comma, therefore he pulled over at the next station. This is now entirely wrong. So an end would be fine, therefore absolutely incorrect. Okay. Why? It doesn't have the power to hold up 2 independent clauses with a comma because it's not a conjunctive adverb. So when you spot 2 independent clauses with a comma, you got to make sure that the connecting word is one of these special 7. Okay. A very common mistake on the test is to have Linda loves fast food, independent clause. She does not like drive-throughs, independent clause. Use a connecting word, specifically a conjunctive adverb, not one of the fanboys. This is incorrect. You cannot hold up 2 independent clauses with a comma and a word other than one of the fanboys. Instead, you would need the semicolon here to make it correct. So that's how the fanboys work. The one other word I do want to show you, and we talked about this earlier, is a subordinating conjunction. What a subordinating conjunction does is if you put it out front, it turns an independent clause into a dependent clause. So if you remember earlier, I think we had something like Sarah spoke. Maybe that was the example. Anyway, Sarah spoke, independent clause. If I put although or because in front of Sarah, now it's a dependent clause. So this is an IC, but although Sarah spoke is a DC, a dependent clause. So just be aware that if you have one of these words out front, then what happens is you have a dependent clause because Remus is violent is a dependent clause. And then all you need is a comma, and then you put your independent clause right after. Okay. But it's not a comma splice because the first thing, although it's a clause, it's not an independent clause, it's a dependent clause. Cool? All right. So then the one other thing we want to talk about is we want to talk about, one, I assume everyone's good on how to use full stops or periods, must have an independent clause on both sides. But let's talk about colons real briefly. Then we'll talk about that one situation I told you to look out for earlier. I'll show you exactly what that is, and then we'll try 3 quick problems together. Okay? So anyway, let's talk about colons. Colon is a little different than a full stop, a semicolon, and a comma with a fanboy. All of these require an independent clause on both sides. I see on both sides. This one only requires that you have an independent clause out front, but you must have an IC out front. Layla regretted her decision to drive her car into London. That is a full subject verb, full idea. What happens after the colon is we're going to further explain what we mean. So whatever comes after a colon is a further clarification or explanation of your original assertion. It can be an independent clause, but it doesn't have to be. It could also be a dependent clause. It could even be a list, which you're probably used to seeing. So Layla regretted her decision to drive her car into London, independent clause. She could not find parking. That explains why she regretted her decision. So it's a further explanation. And in this case, it's an independent clause. But just to show you, and then here's kind of the notes on colons. But just to show you, I could just as easily do either one of these, and these are both correct. So I don't have to have an independent clause second. I just have to have it up front. My brother has an extraordinary talent, independent clause, colon, juggling. That explains what the talent is. If you think about what a list is, a list literally explains whatever your first independent clause was. I need groceries, and then you list off which groceries you need. I'm further explaining what I need. I need groceries, right? Apples, bananas, pears. Okay, so that's further clarifying or explaining the first part. But it's not an independent clause, it's just a list. This, though, had to be an independent clause. Okay, so now you're good on one and two. You know what an independent clause is. You'll have to practice identifying when you do and don't have them. And you know the four ways you're allowed to connect to independent clauses. Only those four. Make sure you know your fanboys. Let me show you what this new situation is that I anticipate a lot of people are going to miss if they haven't practiced it. So, you may be familiar with this first scenario, this contrast example with the semicolon. Damon has an ankle injury. That is an independent clause. He expects to play football in tonight's match. That is an independent clause. Here's the thing, though. The thing is, I really should say game. Well, it depends if I mean American football or UK football. I guess UK football, so match. Anyway, we've got two independent clauses here. We are not using one of our fanboys. We're using a conjunctive adverb. So we need a semicolon. When the semicolon comes before the connecting word, so the connecting word is a contrast, and it's so like a however or a nonetheless. Any connecting word like that, when it's joined with the second independent clause, there's a contrast, right? Damon has an ankle injury. We wouldn't expect him to play. However, despite his injury, he will play. So that's a contrast. Here's what you need to be really careful of, and we'll do an example of this together in a moment, is when, and this is not incorrect, this is correct, when the however or the nonetheless, the contrast word is actually part of the first independent clause. If that's the case, you actually don't have a contrast. It kind of plays like a colon would play, in that the second part is going to further clarify what you mean. Not all television presenters love the camera, however. Some would rather work on the production team away from the spotlight. So the second thing was not a contrast with the first. The first thing I said, presenters don't all love the camera. All I did was I just further explained, what they would prefer instead. So there's no contrast there. So if your contrast word is grouped with the first independent clause, it's actually a further explanation. So that's something to look out for. Let's quickly run through three problems. I'll just show you I'll do a think aloud on each of these. Okay. By the way, when you're taking this test, you'll know it's an independent clause problem almost immediately if you see a semicolon, a full stop, or a comma with one of your fanboys in the answer choices. That's already telling you check for independent clauses. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to check these semicolon ones out and see if I have two independent clauses, one of them is going to be the answer. If I don't, then I get rid of both of them. So some farmers have resorted to renting hives from beekeepers to pollinate their crops. That's an independent clause. When there's a shortage of bees, this being an expensive proposition, that is not an independent clause. Okay. Uh, I'm not going to get into details. Well, it's not. It has a lot to do with when, but it's not a complete idea. So because we don't have two independent clauses, A goes. If you look at D, same thing, independent clause out front, an expensive proposition when there is a shortage of bees. Again, this is not an independent clause. Okay. I know there's a verb, but it's part of the when there is a shortage of bees. So it's just kind of further describing the proposition. So anyway, we don't have two independent clauses there. Because we don't have two independent clauses there, it's not D. The answer to this one is just going to be C. An independent clause, a comma, and then just some extra information that further explains. Some farmers have resorted to renting hives from beekeepers to pollinate their crops, independent clause, an expensive proposition when there's a shortage of bees. Just kind of explaining a little more. It's not B because B is a comma splice. If you want, pause the video and take a moment to read B. You should notice there that you have two independent clauses because this is an expensive proposition is an independent clause. This being your subject is being your verb. Okay, we're going to look at two more problems. We're going to look at 10, and then I'll show you one that has to do with that weird situation or rule I showed you a moment ago with contrast words. But first, let's do 10. Okay, The messages themselves may be quite perfunctory and provide little scope for dramatic interpretation. That's an independent clause. And again, I'm thinking about independent clauses because I see semicolons and I see a comma with one of my fanboys in the answers. So immediately I'm checking independent clauses first. Okay. So I have an independent clause up front. The messages themselves may be quite perfunctory and provide little scope for dramatic interpretation. What do I have on the back end? I have, but they must be read with just the right intonation and emphasis. They must be read with just the right intonation and emphasis is absolutely an independent clause, but is one of my fanboys. I hope you remember this from earlier, but semicolons and fanboys, they never work together. This is absolutely wrong immediately because it's a semicolon and a fanboy. B is the correct one because it's a comma with a fanboy, which is what we want to hold up both our independent clauses. C is a trap, however, does not have the ability to hold up two independent clauses with a comma. It's not one of our fanboys. And D is wrong for the same reason that A is wrong. You're not using a semicolon with one of your fanboys. Okay. We're going to look at problem 56, and then you'll be good to go do this worksheet. I appreciate you taking the time to do this ahead of the worksheet. I think you'll get a benefit from having watched this video and knowing what you're looking at. All right, so let's look at this problem. And again, I'm looking for independent clauses because I see semicolons. Journalists have dubbed Gil Scott-Heron the godfather of rap, a title that has appeared in hundreds of articles about him since the 1990s. Scott-Heron himself resisted the Godfather nickname, however, feeling that it didn't encapsulate his devotion to the broader African American blues music tradition, as well as bluesologist, the moniker he preferred. Okay, so here's the deal. This one, I'm just going to give you the answer first. It's going to be B. The reason why it's going to be B is he resisted the nickname Godfather of Rap. And then we further explain how he resisted it. He actually preferred bluesologist. So instead of being a contrast, it's a further clarification of what you just meant. And if you remember, when it's comma, however, semicolon, or comma, contrast word, semicolon, it's actually not a contrast, right? It's further explaining the first part. And that's what we have here. So that's why it's not D. A lot of people will go for D. D sets up a contrast. We don't have a contrast. It's not A or C because we have an independent clause on both sides. Scott-Heron himself resisted the nickname. He resisted the nickname. Oh, hold on. I am sorry. I'm wrong on this. I'm wrong. Ooh, I shouldn't have picked this problem. Rewind. We do not have two independent clauses. I'm glad I checked that. The second thing is not an independent clause at all. Feeling that it didn't encapsulate his devotion to the broader African American blues music tradition as well as bluesologist, that is not an independent clause. So we just dodged a bullet there. So actually, it's just going to be C, comma. However, is a transition word, but there's no need for a semicolon. In fact, we can't use a semicolon because we're not holding up two independent clauses. So this one's actually going to be C. Let me show you one like what I was just describing, though. I bet I can find one pretty quickly. Hmm, let me see. Ah, I've got you guys. Don't worry. Okay, 52. And as always, you can pause the video and try this one yourself, see if you've got it. So yeah, absolutely pause it, give it a go. I'm just going to say the answer. I'm going to explain why. This one is going to be the comma, however, semicolon phenomenon I talked about. Why? Okinawa doesn't make such decisions single-handedly. That's an independent clause. All historical designations must be approved by a group of 9 other experts. That's an independent clause. So this time I actually checked. Do as I say, not as I do. Independent clause on both sides. What that means is we must have a semicolon. The reason why it's going to be A and not B is because we're further explaining. He doesn't make such decisions single-handedly, and then we explain who else is involved, 9 other people. So not a contrast. This one would be a contrast. Rather, it further explains. Okay. Anyway, that's it for this video. Good luck on the worksheet and good luck with your SAT prep.